Greetings, humans, and welcome to another episode of Black History Highlights. Today, we'll be talking about the lady in this picture by the name of Cathay Williams. If you're interested in visiting her monument, that is located at the Richard Allen Cultural Center in Leavenworth, Kansas. So, let's roll that title card and get started. So, before we can really talk about Cathay Williams, as always, I have to give you a little bit of background information. So, in 1861 to 1865, we have the Civil War going on. As we know, that was the battle between the North and the Southern states. Okay, in the end, eventually the Union wins, which is why we're still a single country. Also, a little bit of background on Buffalo Soldiers, because we'll talk about them at length today. The Buffalo Soldiers were 4 regiments of the cavalry and infantry. They were the 9th and the 10th Cavalry Unit and the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiment. They were formed on September 21st, 1866, and previously they had been 4 regiments of infantry, but they combined 2 and 2. Okay? So these were all black regiments of the regular U.S. Army, and they served in all of the Indian Wars from 1866 to 1890, in the Johnson County War, some in the Spanish-American War. They were some of the first park rangers, gentlemen from the 9th and the 24th Regiments, in the Sierra Nevadas. They fought in the U.S.-Mexican border skirmishes. They fought in World War I and World War II, and in the Korean War. And with the integration of the 24th Infantry Unit, the Buffalo Soldiers were no more as of 1951. So they had an incredibly, almost 100-year history. They have a national museum in Houston, Texas. If you ever had the chance to visit such a place, please visit. Let me know how it was. Okay, so Cathay Williams is a young woman who was born between 1844 and 1842. In September, she's born in Independence, Missouri, to her mother, who was an enslaved woman, and her father, who was a free grocer. Therefore, by her birth, she was enslaved to William Johnson. In basically most of her life, she worked as a house slave on the plantation. But the Johnson family moved from Independence to Jefferson City, Missouri, when Cathay was in her teens. In 1861, the Civil War began, and to the Union soldiers, slaves were considered contraband, so they were confiscated and a lot of times impressed into military service. Women serving as nurses and cooks and laundresses, gentlemen actually fighting actual battles. So Cathay Williams was freed by Union soldiers in the 8th Indiana Volunteer Infantry in 1861, and she was pushed into military service as a cook and laundress. She traveled with the regiment throughout the entirety of the war. In 1864, she served under General Philip Sheridan in D.C. for a time, and in 1865, when the war ended, she was working at Jefferson Barracks in Missouri, kind of back where she started. So being in the South at the end of the war meant that there were not very many employment opportunities for black people, and even less for a woman, because there were only so many things that people would allow women to do at such a time. So a lot of black people joined the military for a lot of reasons that are still currently valid, for the sake of education, having solid pay, health care, and after leaving, a pension. Miss Williams had a cousin and a friend who enlisted and thought Now, Miss Williams had a cousin and a friend that enlisted and thought that in order to provide for herself, she should enlist as well. But the military didn't accept women for service at such a time. So what on earth was a girl to do? The answer? Dress like a man, change her name, and enlist. And since she was a fairly tall woman, 5'9", she could blend in just fine. She switched her first and her last name and became William Cathay. And she went to enlist. Turn the page. But anatomically, she was still a woman. How could they not notice? Well, at the time, there was no required medical physical. So she said she was a 22-year-old cook, and that was enough. They weren't going to ask her to strip down so they could check for any warts or moles or weird stuff like that. They're just like, okay. So, on November 15th, 1866, William Cathay was declared fit for duty. She was assigned to Company A of the 38th Regiments, one of the newly formed all-black regiments. Now, I said there were only the 25th and the 24th. Well, that's because these four regiments that they started out with, 38, 39, 40, and 41, were combined. The 38th and the 41st were combined into the 25th Infantry in 1869. So, Miss Williams was actually assigned to the same company as her cousin and her friend. And they knew who she was, but they didn't out her. So in 1867, in February, they were in the Jefferson Barracks, and then in Missouri, and then they marched in April to Fort Riley in Kansas. In June, they marched to Fort Harker in Kansas. In July, they marched to Fort Union in New Mexico, nearly 500 miles away. Between September and October, they moved to Fort Cummings in Missouri, and they stayed there 8 months protecting miners and traveling immigrants from Apache Indian attacks. In December, a mutiny broke out, and several men were brought up on charges, but Miss Williams was not in that number. During this time, her health was suffering, and she visited 4 separate hospitals on 5 separate occasions. In 1868, June, they marched to Fort Bayard in New Mexico. In July 18th, she was admitted to hospital on base and was diagnosed with neuralgia. Neuralgia is just kind of a catch-all term for any sort of nerve-based pain. During this visit, it was discovered she was a woman, so it took them nearly 2 whole years to figure out there's something off about that Cathay fellow. So in October, she was discharged honorably at Fort Bayard with a certificate of disability. On her discharge, her captain Charles E. Clark said, he has been since feeble, both physically and mentally, much of the time, quite unfit for duty. The origins of his infirmities is unknown to me. And the surgeon said, Mr. Cathay is of a feeble habit. He is continually on sick report without benefit. He is unable to do military duty. This condition predates enlistment. So, with her honorable discharge, and according to her military record, she never saw direct combat. But after leaving the army, she worked still on base at Fort Union in New Mexico as a cook, and eventually she moved to Pueblo, Colorado first, and she married for a short time, but her husband stole her horses and her money, and she had him arrested. After that time, she moved to another city in Colorado, whose name I've left off, city in Colorado, where she worked as a cook, seamstress, laundress, kind of whatever job she could get to support herself. In 1867, she gave the story of her life to a St. Louis reporter who had come to Colorado to visit her, and that story was published in the St. Louis Times on January 2nd, 1876. In 1889 or 1890, she entered the hospital and stayed for about a year and a half. Upon her release in June of 91, she applied for her pension, stating that as a result of her service, she was suffering from deafness, rheumatism, and neuralgia. In September, a doctor came to examine her, and despite seeing that she suffered from neuralgia, diabetes, had all of her toes amputated, and could only walk with a crutch, he rejected her application, saying no disability existed. Now, we don't know exactly when she died, but it was between 1892 and 1900, because as of 1900, her name no longer shows up on the census record. So this is the story of Cathay Williams, or William Cathay, if you're looking for military records. Oh, it's important to note that Cathay Williams has the honor of being the first and only female Buffalo Soldier. They just weren't in there. So that's really cool. There's a little chunk of history for you. I hope you have learned something. I hope you share this with your friends, families, cousins, uncles, cousins, and provide them with a little bit of their history. Again, this bust of Cathay Williams is in Leavenworth, Kentucky. This bust of Miss Williams is in Leavenworth, Kansas, and the Buffalo Soldier Museum is in Houston, Texas. So, I hope you get a chance to visit one or both of them in your future, and I'll see you in my next video. Do good, be good, humans. Hey guys, one last thing I forgot to mention. Check the description box for discussion questions, and that's it. Bye again.